Well, welcome class on this rainy Sunday morning. Amy, our very own Amy Starr Redwine, is with us this morning to pick up on our conversation from last week and answer all the questions that were generated by Mark Ramsey last time. So as you remember, we were discussing current trends in the church, and Amy's going to be picking up on that conversation and talking a little bit more about how that impacts FPC and how we fit into all that. And Amy, I think you might have been announcing your presence to the class a little bit earlier this morning with all that thunder that we heard. So we appreciate you letting us know in advance that you would be joining us. Anyway, we're glad you're with us. Next week, we will have Errol Rohr with us for the month of April. So we look forward to having him. I'll be sending out more information about that this coming week. Please remember, in terms of announcements, that we are still in the process of celebrating Terry Sears' years of service with the church by collecting photos, stories, memories, and cards. So we can continue to send those in or bring those by the church through, I think, this week, I believe. We're still receiving those. Thank you all.
Hey, Drake.
Hey.
I don't think I start on Easter Sunday, do I?
No, you start after Easter Sunday. I'm sorry. You're right, Errol. My bad. No class. No class next Sunday. The following week, Errol will be joining us. Thank you for that clarification, Errol. So, didn't mean to give you a little mini heart attack there.
I'm on my way to the hospital.
Yeah. Thank you. My bad. So yes, next week is Easter Sunday. But thanks to all of you who joined the Nehemiah Action last week. We really appreciate it. Simply joining in really mattered to help influence some of our city council members and the police chief who were there. We didn't attain all the success we were hoping for. We did get some positive responses from two of the city council members and somewhat of a positive response from this police chief, but continue to have faith. Risk is still working very hard to achieve our goals. So we're hoping that we will get the additional funding for the affordable housing and that the police chief will accept the grant from the state to do the analysis on gun violence. But once again, thank you all.
If I may, Drake, I believe we met our FPC 100-person turnout goal.
Good.
Fantastic. First time in several years. We haven't gotten the official numbers yet. So as soon as we have the official numbers, we'll be able to share it widely. I'm still waiting for Risk to tally up all the attendees.
Okay. Sounds good. Appreciate that, Wilson. Also, it is Holy Week, ladies and gentlemen, and the church has numerous offerings this week, including some in-person services, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, which I understand there is still openings for if you'd like to join some prayer services in person. Then Thursday via YouTube, we have the Monday, Thursday service and at 7 p.m. and the Good Friday service at 7 p.m. on Friday. And as you know, the Easter Sunday service will be at 10 p.m. on Sunday. And on Sunday also, please feel free to drop by the church to view the flowering cross, which will be available. I'm assuming, will that be inside or outside?
It'll be on the front steps in the Cary Street lawn area.
Okay. So please feel free to drive by or park and stop and walk by if you'd like, but and put flowers on it.
Well, so the flowers will already be put on it this year.
Okay.
And so,
but you can
always.
I think we're saying if you want to bring a flower and add it in, feel free.
Okay. Yeah. My
you can
wife
also just come take pictures.
You know how the broadcasters on TV have an earpiece and the producers are speaking to them. Well, my wife is speaking to me in my ear and giving me false information. But anyway, so.
And the children's ministry are making Happy Easter yard signs that are going to be all over the front lawn of the church. So you'll certainly not want to miss it.
Yeah, there you go. Appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, well, please remember those on the special concerns list and keep those folks in your thoughts and prayers. And Amy, we were very sorry to see Sarah on that list, but hope she's doing well. But I know we'll all keep her in our thoughts and prayers as well, and hope she improves quickly.
Thank you.
Also, please remember those in the military and their families. If you have any questions during class today, please drop them into the chat function or raise your hand and we'll acknowledge you. Amy, I'm assuming we'll be pausing or taking questions as we go
Yes.
today. I think
Yeah,
that's the normal process we do for questions. So if that works for you, we'll just continue with that. And Amy, unless you or Wilson have any more announcements for the class, I will turn it over to you, Amy.
All right.
We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you, Drake.
Thank you so much for joining.
I'm so happy to be here with you all this morning. Great to see you and really good to be with you. Let's open our time together with a word of prayer. Holy and gracious God, we give you thanks for this new day and for the promises of this holy week. We ask that you would draw us together in your loving care, that you would help us tend to all of the many places of brokenness and suffering in our world, that you would help us especially to be present to you this week and present to one another during our time together. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Well, it is so good to be with you, and I appreciate your prayers for Sarah and our family. She had knee surgery on Friday, so it's been a bit of a weekend in our house, just with the patient in recovery and all the rest. So I told Wilson and Drake and Mary D, I've got the 10-year-old taking care of her during this hour, so hopefully all will go smoothly. And really appreciate your prayers, but she's doing fine. So I am going to tell you what my plan is for our time together. I'm hoping that some of you might have brought some questions that came to you either during Mark's presentation last Sunday or as you've maybe reflected on it in the week. It is my experience, having known Mark for a really long time, that he packs a lot in. And so I thought what I would do is take about 20 minutes or so. He was gracious enough to share his presentation with me, and I have pared it down. But we'll go back through some of it with just to kind of get us back into the mindset that he introduced us to, and then also fill in a bit from more specifically where First Presbyterian Church might fit into so much of what he described. And along the way, I would welcome your questions, either in the chat or, as Drake said, raise your hand, or if you've learned how to use the raise your hand feature in Zoom, that might make me more likely to see it. But I'm hoping that Wilson or Drake or Mary D, if you guys are watching the chat, if I miss something, don't hesitate to just holler. That's one of the challenges of Zoom, right? So I'm going to start this presentation. Here we go. All right. So for years, as Mark said, he has been talking about the changes in the life of the church, both mainline Protestantism, in which the Presbyterian Church and we are a part, but also the church more broadly, both in America and in some ways around the world. He has been saying that we have been in a transition as a church already for quite some time now, and that part of what we are being called to do, and we have been called to do, is rather than try to hurry on this transition to get, using this metaphor, from one side of the bridge to the other side, instead to really settle in and make our home on the bridge in this time of transition. And as he then said, this year of pandemic in 2020, really, we had no choice but to accept life on the bridge and kind of make the most of it. And now, particularly with the availability of vaccines, we are beginning to see that see our way out of this time and really think about what's next. What is next for the church? What is next for us as a church at First Presbyterian in Richmond, Virginia? So I just want to point out that we're not alone in asking this question, right? So this is a new podcast that started up a few weeks ago from Morgan Stanley, but they're looking at what's next in all different kinds of fields. And so just to say that this is a question that I'm sure you are hearing, many of you, in all sorts of places, in workplaces, in schools. I feel like every time I open the paper, there's an article about, how is this going to change our approach to education in significant ways? So we're not alone in asking this question, but I will say, as I think Mark made a really strong case for, it is not a question that we have the luxury of avoiding. So Mark showed this page and kind of went through these images and asked us to think about one or two of them that you think best represent our ministry in the next 2 to 3 years.
Hey, Amy, sorry to
Yeah.
I don't think when you're advancing the slides, it's not coming up, at least on my screen. The slides aren't, I'm just still seeing your cover slide, the covenant class.
Oh, no. Okay, well, let me,
there we go.
Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, let me try to play it again.
Oh, there we go. And now try to advance it a couple slides to see if we see it flipping through.
Do you see that? I just changed it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Technology, people. I mean, I can show it like this.
Right. That works. We do see your notes, but
okay. Well, and I think I can turn that off.
There we go. That works.
Okay. So just to give you a couple of images. Thanks for stopping me, Wilson. We got the bridge. We got making the most of the bridge. This is the visual for that new podcast. And here is the slide that Mark showed with all of these different images that I was just talking about. So we have everything from an orchestra concert to a whitewater rafting adventure to a set of locks. And I would, if anybody is so moved to shout out, or you can put in the chat which one of these pictures, or one or two, really for you captures what ministry might be like in these next few years. Anybody want to share? There's no right answer here. I think we all are just sort of, but it's something to think about in terms of, does it feel contentious? Does it feel communal? Does it feel uncertain? The train, I think of the train tracks with all the different rails crossing each other. So, so a couple more images that Mark shared with us to get us thinking about what ministry could be like and what we have done in different times in our country. So one was a wartime image that he talked about breaking down different kinds of buildings and then just reassembling them in a different place. And, this made me think in some ways of First Presbyterian Church's history of having moved locations so many times in our 200 plus years, which has not necessarily been, reassembling, but in some ways it has. And of course, the buildings, you maybe create some new things, you approach the building differently, but you're sort of reassembling ministry in a new spot in town. But this is one metaphor that we can think about. The place changes, but everything else stays the same. Mark also shared this slide and talked about when our country was, when towns were founded, when settlers were creating these new communities, they were often trying to recreate the most prominent parts of their former life. And it's certainly understandable that we might want to do that as we think about church going forward. We want it to look like the church that we have known. We want to take the things that have meant the most to us and, continue them or transform them. So Mark went through a number of the Old Testament prophets in helping us think about the concept of return. And I wanted to share this quote that really struck me this week. If you get Richard Rohr's daily email devotionals, this whole week was about the prophets. And I think this was from Wednesday's devotional. This quote from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, was a well-known Jewish scholar and theologian who I think has a book on the prophets. So he's really steeped in the prophets. And he talks about the power and the importance of imagination for the prophet. So like a poet, the prophet is endowed with sensibility, enthusiasm, and tenderness, and above all, with a way of thinking imaginatively. Prophecy is the product of poetic imagination. And I thought this was really pertinent to some of what we'll look at here, these quotes that Mark pulled out from some of the prophets, because as we think about the prophets having to work with God's people, particularly during the time of, well, first with Moses, who we consider a prophet, bringing the people out of Egypt and 40 years in the wilderness and then to the promised land, having to continually fire up the people's imagination for what could be, both in the present and in the future. And then also the prophets who were really speaking to God's people during the exile. That prophetic imagination was really critical. So these were some of the quotes that Mark shared from the prophets. I will give them a heart to know that I am the Lord, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God, for they shall return to me with their whole heart. Speaking of return. And then from Joel, rend your hearts and not your clothing, return to the Lord your God, for God is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and relents from punishing. And then this from Zechariah, therefore say to them, thus says the Lord of hosts, return to me, says the Lord of hosts, and I will return to you. So the importance of this mutual return, that it's not just us returning to God, but it is also God returning to God's people. Hosea, but as for you, return to your God, hold fast to love and justice, and wait continually for your God. And speaking here to what we are to tend to as we are waiting for this return, love and justice, right? And then Jeremiah, therefore, thus says the Lord, if you turn back, I will take you back, and you shall stand before me. If you utter what is precious and not what is worthless, you shall serve as my mouth. It is they who turn to you, not you who will turn to them. And Mark asked us particularly to think about that last one. So we have these prophetic themes of returning and what we do while we are preparing to return or waiting to return or for God to return to us. But here from that quote in Jeremiah, if you utter what is precious, not what is worthless. So really, this was something, a question Mark posed. What is precious as we re-engage, and what is worthless, and how do we decide? And I'll just say, I don't seem to be able to see the chat while I'm in this sharing screen mode. So if there are questions or comments popping up, someone let me know.
There aren't any as of yet, Amy.
Okay, that's fine. Just keep me posted. So I think this is a question I would love for us to consider, which is how we discern together what is precious and what is worthless. And I think worthless can sound like kind of a harsh word. I think maybe the way I think about that is, what are the things that we know we want to hold to tightly? And what are the things that we are able and willing to let go of, or even hold more loosely, because we're not sure if they are things that we need to hold on to or not. And so we can just loosen our grip a little bit as we enter into that process of discerning. So I got into a conversation this week with my friend Ryan Bonfiglio, who's an Old Testament professor at Candler School of Theology. He might be mortified if he knew I was sharing this with you, because this was literally just in an email exchange that came after I read an article that he had written, which was about, and I'm gonna share a little bit more about that article in just a minute, but the title of the article was, "Is the Church Dying?" And of course, there has been this narrative over the past 10, even 20 years that the church in America, the mainline church, is on the decline. Mark talked about that a little bit last week. But this article from Ryan Bonfiglio addressed that, and he had said something there, or I think when I responded to it, I said, yeah, we are really in these conversations about this idea of returning to what we knew before the pandemic, returning to worship, returning to more in-person gatherings. And this is what he said that I thought was just so important. When the Israelites headed back to Jerusalem after the exile, they had changed. The place had changed. There were new challenges to face socially and theologically. It certainly wasn't a return to normal, nor even happily ever after. What gives me hope, though, is that the challenge of the return sparked the most prolific period of theological reflection in Israel's history. It's when a good bit of what we call the Old Testament came into existence. Maybe in our return, we can find similarly generative ways forward. Okay, can you imagine if that was just like an email that you fired off in the middle of a workday? My emails aren't usually quite like this, so that was why I wanted to share it. And my response was, okay, can you please write that up into an article now? Because I think this is really important, particularly this part about what is giving him hope, that the challenge of the return sparked the most prolific period of theological reflection in Israel's history. I don't think I realized that until he shared that with me. And it is really exciting to think about that. I do believe the challenges that we have faced both over the last year, but also that we face now and going forward, can really bring us to a place of intense theological reflection. So I am excited for that, and I hope you are too. Mark asked us to think about, is this return or what is this moment? And I wanted to share a couple of metaphors. And this came from Ryan's article, Is the Church Dying? So he said, maybe that's a metaphor that we need to let go of, because when someone is dying, you approach them in a certain way. And that's important to do. I think many of us know the value of hospice care, for example, in helping to, bring a good, peaceful death for folks. But maybe that's not the right metaphor right now, Ryan said in this article. So he offered up two others that I think are helpful for us to think about. The first is that the church is a fallow field. So we've learned in farming, right, that sometimes a field needs to be fallow, even for a few years, for the nutrients to build back up in the soil. And the question with that metaphor is, what can we do then to cultivate the soil so that it yields a more abundant harvest? The other metaphor that he offered was that the church is a lump of clay that God is remolding. And of course, we have that wonderful metaphor in the Old Testament of God as the potter and God's people as the clay. So how in this metaphor can we roll up our sleeves and join God at the potter's wheel, allowing these old forms to be broken down and then to be transformed into something new? So as we think about that, I think Mark offered us a couple of ways. He spoke to us about Paul in Athens in Acts 17, and said that we learn in Acts that Paul both argued in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout people that he found there, but he also went out to the marketplace every day to be with those who are there and to speak to them about these new ideas that he had come to believe about Jesus Christ. So I believe one of the things that these texts call us to do is to hold on to what we have learned this year, even as we returned. Pam Drizel, who was our Carson lecturer back in 2020, in February 2020, reminded us that we don't go to church, we are the church. And one of the things that I think this helps us to remember is that, like Paul, we are called to do ministry with one foot in the church, for example, in what we think of as the church, maybe in our building, but even more so in our community with our people. And then with one foot out in the marketplace, as it was called, in Acts, so in our larger community. And that can be both a physical place that we actually get out into our city and understand the issues there. It can also be a virtual place. And I think about what Drake and Wilson shared about the Nehemiah action. That is our church having a foot out in the marketplace and being engaged and involved with the really serious issues that are happening there. So I think also Mark looked at a few things about Paul and his ministry that we do need to learn from, right? Paul was paying attention to the culture around him. Paul knew, as steeped as he was in the Jewish tradition, that what gets us to today, what worked yesterday, does not necessarily work again today, and it probably won't work tomorrow in the same way. Mark challenged us to plan for and even make changes for a constituency that is not yet present. And one of the way that I have always thought about this in the church is anything we do, particularly on a Sunday morning relative to worship, which is where some people enter into a new church community, we have to do with visitors in mind and not just for ourselves. You know, we have to make sure we're not so caught up in knowing how we do worship that we forget to give the people who may not be familiar with it some guidance and clues along the way. Because there's nothing worse than going to a service, whether it's at a church or anywhere else, and feeling like everybody else knows what to do and I don't know what to do. But also, I think this important piece that Paul's message did not change, the message of Christ crucified and risen. So Mark shared with us a bit about what he and his folks at Macedonian Ministries and the Ministry Collaborative are learning. And also, I wanted to think for a moment about how we at FPC are implementing some of this learning. So here was the list that he gave, and it started with doing less and going deeper. And he told that metaphor from the ranchers out west of digging deeper wells rather than fences around the property. If you dig a deeper well with cool, nourishing water, the animals will stay in proximity to that. So for us at FPC, this is a metaphor that I've used with the session, and that one of the things that we have really focused on in our leadership is to spend time at every meeting really digging this deeper well, which I would call doing the spiritual work that we want our leaders to be doing, and also thinking strategically and generatively about what we're doing as a church and about what the future might hold, so that we're not just focused on the burning question of the present moment, which is often questions of the budget or the building or what program that might need our attention, but trying to look beyond the urgency of the present and plan and seek where God is going in the future. This idea that God loves the world more than God loves the church, which I'm sure you've heard us say, particularly during the pandemic, that the decisions that we have made about how to do our ministry during this pandemic have not just been what is best for our community alone, but how can we make decisions that really serve the larger community and acknowledge some of the challenges that our neighbors face that we in our community may not face in the same way, but we can make choices that impact them for the better. Learning to be grateful for change. I mean, this is really hard. It's hard for everyone. We just changed around 2 rooms in our house, and it made me cranky for a whole day because it's just hard when things like that are disruptive. But after a day, I began to, walk in the room. Oh, this is really nice. Like, that was a good change, but it takes time. And I really believe that change is a muscle that has to be used so that it can be strong. And sometimes, I know there's an old adage that you don't make change for the sake of change, but I actually think sometimes that's not a bad thing because it helps us use and keep that muscle strong. This time for localized ecclesiology and collaboration to know what's happening in our community, particularly with the other churches. I'll tell you, many of you may have seen an article in the paper that there was a commemoration downtown Richmond for the marking a year of the pandemic. And there was clergy there. And the only thing I knew about that was when I read about it in the paper. And that just raised a question for me about the relationships that we have and what is our place as a church in the city that we are a part of, even though we're not downtown, right? This is our community. So I think those are good questions to raise and think about. I really love this that Mark shared, that sit and get is over, and that now is the time of contend and send. And this gets at, and I talked about this in a sermon a few weeks ago, the difference between discipleship, which is really, we think of as learning, and apostleship, which is when we are sent out to share the gospel in really concrete ways, to live the gospel, not just share it with our voices. I think that's what we think of, but to actually be people who are steeped in the ways of the unconditional love that we learn from Jesus. And then not to underestimate institutional suspicion, especially from the younger generations. And Mark talked about this at length. I wanted to share one thing that he shared after actually our, I think he found it like the next day, that the number one quality non-Christians and lapsed Christians look for in a person with whom to talk about faith is listens without judgment. And I thought this was great, thinking about, for those of you who've been working through the Lenten devotional about listening that we've shared, have been thinking a lot about listening during this season and what it means to listen without judgment. But a minority, 34%, says the Christians they know actually possess that quality. So I think this is something for us to think of, particularly with the institutional suspicion of some of our younger generations. How do we move past that? So Mark also encouraged us not to underestimate people's spiritual hunger about Jesus, and knowing that this is what the church has to offer more than anything else. We can offer Jesus, who Jesus is, what he taught, how he changes our lives, how he helps us think differently about ourselves and our world. And then he also encouraged us to use this opportunity to reintroduce ourselves to our culture as a place of care, community, connection, depth, and equity. So I'm going to pause there and see what, having reviewed all of this, what questions, comments does this raise for you all in thinking about what's next for us as a community of faith? I'm scrolling through.
Amy, this is Drake.
Yeah.
Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, we can, Drake. Go ahead.
Yeah, I love that last slide. You're talking about listening. I think that's what, society and, across the United States and the world today, we kind of stopped listening to each other and those with opposing views. So I think that's certainly a great place to start and to move forward, that we do start listening to each other, show respect for each other's people's views, and be kind at the end of the day. So, but I was also wondering, how does in all of this, obviously the pandemic and everything has forced us to, embrace technology more. How does that, how does FPC plan to plug into that, to connect with people, to listen to people better, maybe, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'd love to talk about that, Drake, because that's something that we really started thinking about early on in this season. And of course, as so many people have noted, we as a community were so fortunate to have a couple of people on staff or connected with our church who could really help us pivot to a kind of technologically savvy and effective online ministry. And of course, that includes Rob Collins and his amazing videography work that I think has made our Sunday services effective online. And I really appreciate that, how much people recognize that. I think a lot of what we were able to do online and pivoting our ministries, including our educational ministries like this class and our children's ministries, which have been so effective, are thanks to Kendra Crabtree, who during most of that time was our director of communications and really helped us to make that pivot. So a couple of things that we've done to make sure we attend to those things moving forward are to actually create a new position that's called the Audio Visual Technology Coordinator. And this is going to be a full-time person who is on our staff to help us run all things technology, from the Sunday morning broadcasts, whether they are pre-recorded or whether they are live streamed from our sanctuary into people's homes. We made a big investment in installing live stream equipment, and we'll be rolling that out this week with our in-person services. So if you're not coming in person, you will be able to experience the live stream from your homes. So that's going to feel different than the pre-recorded. But I think that was a really important move that we made during this time. The other thing, of course, is getting really comfortable with virtual gatherings like this one over Zoom. But one thing I'm thinking of is when we are ready to come back, and of course, we have had some in-person small group meetings now for several months, but I think we're going to need to be able to do a hybrid offering. There may be people who want to join in from home for any kind of reason, right? Whether they're traveling or they're, just don't want to come in that day, or still feeling very cautious about exposure. So we've invested in a technology that makes that more effective and pleasing to be on one end of an in-person, to be the virtual person in an in-person meeting. So we'll be working on using that. So those are a couple of examples that I could give. Mary D, I see your hand. I also see some things in the chat.
I was just going to draw your attention to those. We have a number of really great questions.
Yes, I'm gonna start addressing those now. So the first one that I see from Susan is the questions on slide 17. So slide 17 was these new metaphors that Ryan Bonfiglio offered, the church as a fallow field. And the question was, what can we do to cultivate the soil so that it yields a more abundant harvest? And I think, and Susan, I don't know if you had a comment about those questions. The other
No, I
question,
just thought those were good starting points.
yeah, I thought they were too. The other metaphor was the church as a lump of clay, and the question was, how can we roll up our sleeves and join God at the potter's wheel, allowing old forms to be transformed into new forms? And I would say, yeah, go ahead, Susan, please.
Well, I guess I would say also with the about the potter's wheel, that one, because I do a lot of sewing and stuff, that one drew me with the quilting, because like with quilting, you take something and you go back, you're putting together pieces. And I just want to make sure we don't forget to look at all the pieces. And so, because if you do, then all of a sudden you've got a hole in the quilt or in the potter's, so I just want to make sure everyone feels that everything has been looked at.
That's a great point. And I love the quilting metaphor. And you're right, you have to hone in on the details of the stitches, but you're going to end up with a funky product if you don't have a plan for the whole, right? And so I think that's critically important for us to attend to as a congregation, and certainly our leadership. And one of the things that we've really tried to do in session is to make sure that everyone is aware of the whole, that everyone knows that in a church our size, we have a lot of hardworking councils and committees that are really the ones doing the in the weeds of the work. And then it is session's job to be sort of holding the whole and trying to think about making sure that those in the weeds know what the quilt is what we want the quilt to look like when it's done. So I think those are really important metaphors, right? And thinking about the metaphor of the field, in order to make the field fertile, we need to know what we're planning, what the plan is for that field, what's going to be planted there, and what kind of nutrients do those crops need. So we have to have a bigger plan in mind, which I think is really important. Cheryl asked what we mean by equity, and this was the slide about reintroducing ourselves as a place of care, community, connection, depth, and equity. Mark is not here to answer that question because he is the one who kind of came up with those categories. But what I would say about the answer to that is that we, as God's people, have always been called to think about how each person, every group is being tended to and included in not just our church, but even in the larger community that we serve. That equity is more than just equality and everyone having the same opportunities, but it actually looks at, what are some of the things that some people don't even have options for, and how can we try to help create our community to be a place where those needs are tended to. In the Old Testament times, this is what was God was looking or helping the people think about when there was a priority to serve and care for widows and orphans and refugees, because these were people in that society that had very little power, very little in the way of resources. And so God's people have always been called to tend to those who are on the margins and, lift them up and pull them in. Connie asked, how do we go about making these decisions about going forward? Everyone involved. I don't know if that's a question about who's involved, leadership, committees. And I would say, yes, all of the above. So there are lots of conversations taking place right now at pretty much every level of church life. Different committees are having conversations about, the worship council met last week to finalize a phased plan to return to in-person worship that they will be presenting both to the coronavirus task force and to the session. So you'll be hearing more about that going forward. The Faith Formation Council and the different committees underneath that council is talking about, what is education going to look like going forward? What is our ministry to families going to look like going forward? Last Monday at the session meeting, we heard a wonderful presentation by Janet LeGros about the values that that form the foundation of our ministry to families and children. And these will be the values that help us as we go forward. As many people have shared with us, families have tasted something during this pandemic in terms of being less programmed, less scheduled, that every family I know does not want to go back to the way things were for their sort of over-scheduled children. So how do we as a church support that desire? So let's see, there's a question, as someone who deeply benefited from your technology outreach, the value of FPC has been the energizing mass of diverse thought and actions. Living in a rural community, the face of our Reformed faith is elderly and burned out. I ask myself, how can I use my connection to you to re-enter the field here, renewed and fortified? And that was from Joan Witchy. Thank you, Joan. I really, really appreciate a couple of things that you've lifted up there and that I want to make sure that everybody here is aware of. And one is that we have had people join our congregation throughout this year when our worship has been fully online. People have found us because we were online and because they appreciated what we offered. And so that's been a really interesting thing for us to see. And as Mary Kay shared a couple weeks ago, our attendance online by some measures has been better than it was in person. So we're really thinking about, how do we continue? I don't think we can go back from that. It doesn't mean we won't have worship in our sanctuary, but it does mean that we will need to continue to have an online presence, because that is where we are being called to reach some people. But I love that you are asking this question, Joan, about how you can use your connection to the church to re-enter the field here renewed and fortified. And I would love it if everyone is asking that question, because it is absolutely going to take all of us coming together and sharing what we've learned. And this community, the congregation here at FPC, has so much richness, so much diversity of thought and actions, so much passion and compassion, that I really am eager for folks to be able to engage during this next season as we ask some hard questions and make some hard decisions. And I also just want to say, we want to hear from you. You know, we are trying to do the work of listening to our community. It's a challenge in the current circumstances. I've said, sometimes I feel like I'm doing ministry behind a brick wall, you know, and I just am not 100% sure what's going on the other side. So please, if you have thoughts, more questions, just things you want to share about what has fed you during this year, what you've missed, we would love to hear about them. I would love to hear about them. All of our pastoral and program staff would welcome the opportunity to have more conversation and to get to practice our listening. And I also hope you'll do that for one another and really listen to those that you are connected to in the First Presbyterian community, and think about the ways that all of the talents and resources that you have can be engaged as we seek to for our ministry to be transformed in this season of return. And I would just return to that wonderful quote that I included from Ryan, where we think about the fact that when Israel did return from exile, as hard as that was, there was some really important theological thinking that happened there. And I believe that the same can be true for us. So I know there's a couple of other questions, but I'm keeping my eye on the clock because worship is right around the corner here. So thank you for having me and letting me share all of this today, and for the great questions.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us, Amy. We're always thrilled to have you, and especially since you've got so much going on. And you're not only in church, but with your daughter and all. We hope for a speedy recovery. So thanks so much. And I do think the church has done a fantastic job of pivoting kind of to the digital world in this era of COVID and all that. So y'all have done super. We really, I think all of us really appreciate that and helped us stay plugged in with the church. But please remember for the rest of the group, thank you all for joining today. Please remember to plug into all the Holy Week opportunities of the church. And then not this coming Sunday, but the following Sunday, Errol Rohr will be with us to discuss mere morality, the faith of ethics and the ethics of faith. There you go. It's a little tongue twister there. But anyway, we look forward to having Errol with us in a couple of weeks. So thanks so much for joining, everybody. Have a safe and healthy week. And thanks so much again, Amy.
Thank you. It's great
Bye-bye.
to be with you.
Thanks.